Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And, well, you read the title. These are 10 albums that I changed my opinion on. You know, the great thing about opinions is that they're never set in stone. Sometimes I can argue a point in a video and then a month later I end up having different feelings. And yeah, you'd think this would be frustrating when I look back on an old video of mine and think, nah, I don't really stand by this anymore. But not really. If the video's bad, that's one thing. And some of the albums I've included in this list I also kinda hate the review of, but more because the videos are bad and not specifically because my feelings are different now. They show my perspective at the time and were true to how I felt at the time. Now I'll be real, changing my mind on albums after reviews isn't something that happens super often, because a lot of the videos I post to this channel show me looking at some project from my childhood or that I was really into when I was in high school, or something like that, and they already had a few years to sit with me once I covered them. But I also do cover a lot of new albums, and sometimes they can catch me off guard, and my perspective will obviously be liable to change afterwards. And some of the albums I included here I have already alluded to my opinion changing in the past, be it thanks to a year-end list placement, or an in brief segment, or something else like that. But I mainly made my choices based on which albums my opinion has changed the most drastically and most differ from when I first posted my review. Like, you're not going to find albums on here that just went up or down or a quarter point with all my general thoughts not really changing. I can't think of a good example of that off the top of my head anyway, but, you know, whatever. Here are 10 albums that I changed my mind on, in no particular order, starting out with the album that I revisited most recently and made me want to go through with this video in the first place, Fortet, New Energy. When New Energy came out, I let that one really sit and I gave it so many chances because I love Fortet's music and I generally liked the singles I heard leading up to it. I heard so many people around me praising the album too, but after listen 11 or 12 or however many I'd made it up to, it had only worsened for me, and I just gave up and called it his most underwhelming project to date. That disappointment I showed in that video is some of the most palpable I've ever shown. You could not fake that. I was so sure it was gonna be one of my favorites of the year, and it was just not clicking with me at all. For months after the fact, it may very well have been the most disappointed I'd been in a new album from an artist I've loved, ever. And somehow it's finally clicked with me now. I still don't think New Energy is on par with Rounds or There Is Love in You, and not to say a lot of my criticisms don't still stand now. I think it runs on too long for its own good, and the long silences between some of the tracks are still annoying. But maybe the amount of time I wore this album into the ground and got nothing did help to some extent, because several tracks on there continually stuck with me and I never forgot them. And once I gave it enough time and space, that comfy, meditative, minimal techno vibe it created just really started to work for me. This album really feels like it has its place now. Moments like 2017, SW99SL, Scientists, and Lush, especially Lush, they've really stuck with me and become standout moments in his catalog. Even previous low points like LA Trance, You Are Loved, and Planet also grew on me. I think the moment at which this album finally started to cement itself into my life was when he dropped his Live at Funkhouse Berlin concert album last year. He mashed these tracks up and segued them into each other and fleshed them out in such a refreshing way that I'm still completely floored by. That concert album is one of my favorite moments in the entire history of Fortet, and maybe one of my favorite live albums I've ever heard. Just the way it re-energized some of his most underwhelming moments and made them shine and feel on par with his best material. If you're a Fortet fan and haven't listened to Live at Funkhouse Berlin, I highly suggest doing so. But yes, New Energy, even divorced from the live context, is one of the biggest turnarounds I've ever had on an album. At the time, I gave it a 6.7, and even that felt pretty generous. But now it's at least a 7.7, or maybe even breaking into the low 8 range depending on my mood. It's become one of the strongest later period Fortet albums overall. Even got to the point where just the other day I decided on a whim to throw together like a tribute cover mashup of the track Lush and post it on my 256 Pi Music channel. I'll link that in the description. But alright, let's move on. Next up, the Chemical Brothers, Born in the Echoes. Half this list is going to be albums that really grew on me, and half are albums that shrunk on me. Born in the Echoes is in the latter category. Now don't get me wrong, I still think this album is good, but at the time I went nuts for this. I gave it an 8.3. Not only was it my third ever video and the first one where I got to talk about a band that I had previous history with, and that drove a lot of my excitement, but also this album came at a time when I was really itching for something banger heavy like The Chemicals could usually deliver, and they delivered exactly what I wanted. I was so excited. It was definitely great at the time, but now they've moved on, and so did I, and coming back to it, this is kind of a weak and unoriginal project for them. A project like No Geography helps put this one in perspective. That album is so much more vivid and memorable and has so much more standouts. Born in the Echoes just kinda delivers the bare essentials on what you'd want out of a Chemicals project and delivers nothing you haven't heard from them already. It's got solid variety and is still a pretty fun and well-balanced listen, has its fair share of highlights, but there's only one song on it that I would say is truly great, Go, and very little of this project outside of that one track goes the extra mile for me or stands as particularly memorable. And it probably has the single weakest opener on any Chemicals album as well. Sometimes I Feel So Deserted is so one-note and tedious to me now and is probably my least favorite track on the album. Coming from these guys who almost always start their albums out with a bang, it's kind of a letdown. I'm not at all opposed to re-listening to this thing, it's far from bad and it's still more consistent than We Are the Night, but it's definitely not great to me anymore. It's probably like a 7.3 at the very best. Next up, DJ Shadow, The Mountain Will Fall.
Nobody speak, nobody get choked.
3 years ago, this album caught me completely off guard. I was already a big fan of DJ Shadow, obviously love his groundbreaking sample matching stuff on Introducing and The Private Press, and even liked his detour into straight commercial hyphy style rap on The Outsider and his experiments on The Less You Know The Better. But I was not prepared for a trap album from him. And this was at the time where I was still salty at the inescapability of the Harlem Shake. I used to hate trap music in general, and all the electronic artists' attempts at the genre. So in comes Shadow, an artist I love, making me confront my general distaste for the genre head on and take it seriously. It certainly wasn't immediate, had a lot of low points like Three Ralphs, and it had tracks like Nobody Speak that was way better than everything else on the album, but felt a little out of place, and probably made it harder to get over the shock of the style change everywhere else. At the time I gave it a 7.7, but that was mainly out of complete astonishment that I enjoyed an album in this style to any capacity, and I wasn't really expecting to have the amount of replayability that it did, let alone becoming this giant personal watershed moment that turned me around on an entire genre. It is rock solid to me now. Almost every track has something memorable to stick with me. Even Three Ralph, despite being easily the worst track, is still not that bad, and feels like it was supposed to put you off on purpose, like his earlier track Three Freaks. And not getting into how impactful the actual highlights like Ashes to Oceans and all those have really become. The whole thing is undoubtedly in like the mid-lower 8 range at least. At the time it was good, if extremely off-putting, but it's really stuck around and holds up really freaking well to this day. Very creative and forward-thinking album from an artist who could have been stuck in the past but instead helped expand my horizons. Oh, and while I'm at it, the companion EP, The Mountain Has Fallen, has admittedly shrunk on me quite a bit. I tried adding it to the end of the main album, since at the time I thought Corridors would be a better album ending than Suicide Pact, and the EP as a whole would have helped tracks like Nobody Speak and Sideshow to feel less out of place, but nah, sticking it on the end just overstuffed the album and wore it down. Best experience separately, but the album itself, still great, still feels cutting edge even now. Next up I got VT, Electronic Opus. I've talked about my thoughts changing on this one and my phantom menacing on it before, but may as well get this out for the record. First of all, no, this has nothing to do with those stories of remix stealing on the Flaming June rework. At this point, I'm convinced that whole crap was just an exaggerated coincidence that got blown way out of proportion. No, this shrunk on me because it now feels spotty and often redundant. At the time, I knew the issues I had with it, but was so blinded by how much I loved the idea of orchestral reworks of BT songs that I ignored any possible criticisms. But a lot of these tracks feel copy-pasted from the originals with the orchestra lazily tacked on. Not to say it doesn't still have its moments that really stick with me. The reworks of Flaming June, Love Comes Again, 1.618, Skylarking, Forget Me, and Satellite are all great, and feel like they offer an experience that you couldn't get out of the original. The rework of Somnambula Simply Being Loved also feels like it had a big upgrade, both from the orchestra and stutter editing. And I guess the rework of The Silent Hearts is cool too, even if I wish it had been reworked more. But the remix of Ferris Wheel and Good Morning Kaya are redundant and barely add to the originals. The Emergency and Suddenly are not only not reworked at all, but also cut down to a fraction of their original length, and feel like they're only there out of obligation or something. And the remixes of Dreaming in a Million Stars, they're good, but they replace Kirsty Hawkshaw for Jess Braden, which is a redundant non-upgrade that only served to unnecessarily piss off the former, who apparently wasn't even contacted in the first place. That's pretty stupid, and kind of makes those a little uncomfortable to listen to. The album's still really enjoyable. My enjoyment is at worst like in the higher 7 range. But I was trying to convince myself that it was in the 9 range, because I paid to contribute to the Kickstarter campaign during a time when I was completely broke. I was so all in on this idea and was so convinced that BT would pull it off perfectly because I was such an obsessive fan of his, and I loved orchestral rework albums like the one Basement Jaxx did. And it took me a long time to admit that Electronic Opus is kinda spotty and could have been done so much better than it actually was. I still like it, but it certainly would not be my favorite album of 2015 if I were doing that list retrospectively. Next up, David Guetta, Just a Little More Love. This album, like all David Guetta albums, is not good. And I have no urge to ever go back to it and listen to it again. But it did definitely throw me for a loop when I first heard it because of how different a flavor of bad it was from his later stuff like Nothing But the Beat. This album is the kind of bad that you expect out of like some obscure Bandcamp artist that has some potential but no budget. It's very cheap sounding, and it sounds like he, along with Joachim Garraud and Chris Willis, were just a bunch of nobody friends that threw everything together in Guetta's basement. Even if that's not technically true, and Garraud had just come off the heels of co-producing one of Jean-Michel Jarre's best albums in 1999, this album still sounds like it came from a bunch of nobodies. And for what it's worth, this kind of low-budget, cheap-sounding bad that you typically get out of obscure no-name artists is a hell of a lot easier to swallow than the kind of big-budget, major-label bad that I expect out of Guetta. It felt like this was really doing something to bring him down to earth and make him feel more relatable as a producer. Like, once upon a time, even an artist as ubiquitous as him was a nobody, too. But once that novelty's worn off, this is just kind of a tedious listen. A track like Atomic Food is absolutely mind-blowing when you hear it for the first time, and I stand by everyone should hear it at least once in their lifetime, but you probably don't need to hear it more than once. There are a small handful of moments that still hold up alright. I still like Give Me Something in 133, and again, Chris Willis is an enjoyable present and one of the only singers who's ever sounded like he's having fun singing over Guetta's instrumentals. I like him, but the album has little to no replay value, and once the shock of Guetta not being the worst thing ever here is worn off, this thing's mostly just kinda bland. Even the 2 big singles, the title track and Love Don't Let Me Go, have better versions with the Wally Lopez remix and Walking Away mashup respectively. And these originals aren't as fun to come back to. Not that I really have an urge to come back to them anymore either way. But if I did, it wouldn't be the versions on this album. I gave this one a pass when I reviewed it because I was so used to Guetta being the bottom of the barrel, and this was so much better than what I was used to from him. But he didn't exactly set the bar high with those other projects. I'd honestly much rather return to One Love. Despite how bad that album is, it's the kind of bad that I find entertaining. It's often unintentionally hilarious and has a little bit of nostalgia from growing up in the Black Eyed Peas era, too. This debut, though, is just meh, like low 6 range if I'm generous. Next up, Meet Pete Manifesto, Impossible Star. This one really caught me off guard, but in a very different way from The Mountain Will Fall. Like, when I reviewed it, I was just getting myself into MBM for the first time. They were another 90s UK dance legend that I felt I needed under my belt but hadn't gotten around to listening to, and was more concerned with catching up than I was with the new album itself. And at the time, I thought Impossible Star was cool. I listened to it repeatedly like 8 times and could muster a 7.3 for it at my most generous. But it wasn't doing anything mind-blowing or resonating with me emotionally much. A lot of listens leading up to the review were probably more in the lower 6 range. But I did feel like there was something there below the surface that I couldn't put my finger on, some creative elements there that I couldn't deny, so I felt inclined to be nicer to it. I left it by the wayside and forgot about it and didn't return to it a single time until I was starting work on that Some Stuff I Missed video and getting ready to talk about their Opaque Couché album, which was basically Impossible Star B-sides. So I listened to Impossible Star again to refresh my memory, and suddenly, poof, I absolutely loved it. Just out of nowhere, I went from being mildly underwhelmed to thinking this project is freaking great. It just clicked all at once and blew me away. I don't think I've ever had an album click with me that fast and after such a long delay. The spacey, menacing aesthetic along with its jazzy elements all came together and wowed me. The atmosphere was great and felt really futuristic despite a fair few retro-leaning textures. The beats were all bangers, and the melodies and textures. This is where all those repeat listens from before paid off in a big way, because even though there weren't any big earworms or anything that I was really able to play back in my head, they had that little sense of familiarity to them. And so, like, when I would go back, I'd be like, oh yeah, I remember this now. I don't know how it happened in the way it did, how it managed to go from a fairly middling 7.3, not touching it at all for like 2 years, and then suddenly jumping up to 8.3 once I finally came back, but that's what happened, and I now think this album is brilliant. Better late than ever, I suppose. Next up, Lantis Pharmacy. We'll have forever tonight. Yep, the first review I ever did, and like all first-time reviews, this video is not very good. I pretty much admitted that I was giving it a really surface-level discussion. I constantly compared them to Clean Bandit, which really does not feel warranted in retrospect. My voice sounded weird, I had a fan on in the background, and I also let the album off way too easily. I think I probably had more of a stomach for bright, peppy EDM and pitch-shifted vocals back in the day, so I was more inclined to give it a pass. I wouldn't say the album is outright terrible now, but a lot of the things I mentioned that I said could have been really annoying then fulfilled their potential for annoyance when I came back to it later. This album is extremely one-note and samey. It's ridiculously formulaic and predictable to the point of all 13 of these tracks sounding almost identical, even often really similar melodies and chord progressions. It's really shameless. And most of the vocals sound pretty bad too, thanks to all the pitch shifting and other applicable effects. Some people tried to tell me that their lyrics were really deep, probably because it was the one element of the album that I didn't even try to read into. But no, there's nothing deep about the lyrics on this album. They're just your typical shallow and vague EDM lyrics. I mean, if a track doesn't have a good hook to back it up, then it'll get grating really quick, and honestly, this thing wears out my patience pretty quickly. A track like Peanut Butter Jelly, which I liked before, got unbearably corny coming back to it despite a good drop, and those air horns are fucking inexcusable. Not to say this album doesn't still have good qualities to it that I can understand why I might have been kinder to it back then. Every track is so ridiculously earnest and innocent that it's hard to get mad at, and all the performers sound like they're all at least trying. It's not as dull a drag as something from Guetta or Steve Aoki. Galantis also do have a style that I'd be able to recognize at a distance, and these tracks do have satisfying build-ups and payoffs, even has a fair few tracks with hooks that I could still remember despite listening to the album, like, twice since posting the video in 2015. I don't hate this album, and quite frankly, it is still miraculous that it's as listenable as it is. But they're still total one-trick ponies at best here, and I do not have room in my life for this album these days. If I were covering it now, I can't imagine it gets scored higher than a solid 6, maybe even in the upper 5 range. Pharmacy is not terrible, I still get the appeal, but it's pretty mediocre to me in retrospect. I really wish my first review was of a more interesting outfit than this, but it is what it is, I suppose. Next up, Renier Parish. I don't think a lot of people saw this review, but yeah, this album really grew on me since I made my video on it. At the time, I thought the production sounded really cheap, not that well mastered. I still stand by that despite it coming from a no-budget obscure Bandcamp artist and being excusable. I think he might have even remastered it since I posted my video, and it still doesn't exactly sound professional coming back to it. It does sound kinda different than I remember in parts, but not so different that I can tell for sure whether it's changed. I also had a lot of nitpicks with the track order and how I think it could have been laid out differently and end up telling a pretty cohesive story. But even with all that in mind, this is definitely an album that's stuck with me. It didn't crack into my regular listening rotation, but I could still easily recall the tune to pretty much every track on here, And for what it's worth, anytime I did come back, I enjoyed pretty much the whole thing from front to back. I think the cheapness of the production doesn't take away from the effect it's going for either. Like, the emotions he's trying to convey, both through his delivery and through the lyrics, really came across well. It hit a really raw and personal note to the point of even scaring me and getting worried for his personal safety on some listens while I was reviewing it. It's a really personal and down-to-earth album. It feels like it's just some random dude who isn't all that well off to begin with going through this painful breakup, and the cheapness of the production helps play into that. I don't think this album is perfect by any stretch, but it is really solid and a definite grower. A lot of the problems I described in my review have kind of become less noticeable for me now. Would highly recommend giving it a shot if you like some low-key, depressing bedroom pop. I think it does very well for what it was trying to do, and has stuck out in my memory more than I would have expected. Next up, Underworld, Barbara Barbara, We Face a Shining Future. I really gave this an 8.3, huh? Not really sure how that happened. I think it might have had to do with the fact that I had just finished marathoning the Underworld discography, and this was a comeback after two pretty underwhelming entrants in their catalog, Oblivion with Bells and Barking. The former I might have to give a second chance. And on top of that, I remember liking how this album was both unmistakably Underworld and delivered on their core appeal, but also felt like an expansion on their usual sound and felt like its own thing and not a retread. And I still like it for that same reason. But now I feel like I have a bit more perspective since they started up the whole Drift series and continually put out material roughly on par with this album every couple of months. And I think a lot of the Drift material is even better than the stuff on here. Like, this album isn't exactly bad, there aren't any outright clunkers on here, but there's only one track on here that approaches great for me now with Low Burn. I remember liking I Exhale and If Raw for having a bit more their traditional banger and talk, sing style. Even if coming back to them, they're only good and not great, and aren't among the most memorable or hard-hitting bangers they've ever put out. And I think the track Nylon Strung is a cool ending if it takes a while to really get going. Aside from that, though, it's just kind of alright, I guess. It's about on par with one out-of-context episode of Drift. It has enough of an identity among their back catalog to justify its existence, but isn't fleshed out enough to be satisfying as a proper mainline album from them. It's like a low 7 or a high 6 to me now, and their material from this hyper-productive 2019 has made this project feel a lot less impressive or special. It almost feels like they could make an album like this in their sleep now. Not bad, has its moments, and even at its worst is still mildly enjoyable, but it's certainly not great and not the best stuff they've ever done. And finally, we're finished with Air Pocket Symphony. Alright, so we're finishing with an album that was a much slower grower than the other entrants on this list, but one that absolutely has to be mentioned here, because it's become just as much of a fixture of my life as Moon Safari or 10,000 Hertz Legend, at least replay value-wise, and only after I reviewed it. Before reviewing it, all my thoughts expressed in the video stood for years. I always thought it was kinda clumsy and inconsistent, and didn't come together as a whole all that well. Had tracks like Napalm Love and Murder Japan, which I didn't think really gelled well next to all the moody piano soundtrack-ish stuff that the bulk of the album goes for. And there were a couple of tracks that I always found underwhelming, like One Hell of a Party and Left Bank and Redhead Girl. I certainly think an album like Talkie Walkie is more cohesive and well put together as a whole, but just personal enjoyment-wise, I think this album, in the years following my review, may have ended up surpassing Talkie Walkie. Not only do these above-mentioned criticisms not really apply as strongly as they did before, like Murder Japan is not nearly as out of place a jolt as I made it out to be, Sexy Boy is much worse in retrospect, and all the least favorite tracks still work well for me. They're still all good. But more than anything, the mood this album created is just so well executed and enveloping. I come back to it all the time these days. It's just so well produced and so comforting, and that melancholy nocturnal vibe is just so fantastically well done and emotionally affecting. Do I skip tracks sometimes? Yeah, sure. Sometimes I'll just put this on to only hear Once Upon a Time and not hear anything else. But I can absolutely just put this thing on and let it play out the way it does, and it'll all feel perfectly natural to me. The childhood nostalgia may play a little bit into that too, because Air is, after all, one of my all-time favorite bands. They mean so much to me. They've really helped shape my musical tastes for years, and Pocket Symphony is no exception to that rule. But this one also has come to really deliver something that I can't get out of any of the other Air albums. Pocket Symphony is very much like a warm comfort food type album when I'm in a downbeat mood and need something to help me feel better. I found myself gravitating towards this album over even Moon Safari or 10,000 Hertz Legend. Moon Safari can definitely deliver in that way, but it's so short, and I really wish Sexy Boy was placed elsewhere in the album. And 10,000 Hertz, while the mood is great as always, I mainly like it for how weird, out-of-the-box, and experimental it is for them, and tends to be better if I want something creepier and more unsettling. Still probably like those albums more. I've gotten a few more years of mileage out of them. But the warm, piano-centric mood created by Pocket Symphony just has this alluring quality to it that the others don't, and feels like it can go even deeper and get even stronger emotional reaction than those two sometimes. Of all the albums highlighted in this video, Pocket Symphony is probably the highest rated I'd have. Originally a 7.5 when I reviewed it, but now like an 8.5 to 8.7, and absolutely one of their strongest and most underrated releases. And it makes me really miss Air and wish they'd put out a new album. Oh well. But yeah, that's the list. I'll leave it at that. Of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.